Hi everyone, welcome back to the shop. I'm Brent Shively, Product and Application Trainer with Festool North America. Big thank you to all the people that participated in the Instagram poll to help me decide what we're going to build in this build series, as well as the future build series. With all the votes we received, the clear winner was the Fireplace Mantel. If you want to follow along with the build plans and material lists for this build series, as well as the previous build series, check out the link in the description below. To get things started, let's talk about the design of the Fireplace Mantel. There's a lot of different ways to build a fireplace mantle and a lot of different things you can incorporate. For this mantle, I had three main things I was looking at. One was it's an electric ventless fireplace. The second one, I wanted to build it modular so I can assemble it in the shop and then take it to the job site. The third one is it's all going to be paint grade. So I've designed this to be built in three separate pieces. We've got the two legs or tapered columns and the top of the mantle itself. The tapered columns are going to be made out of Baltic birch, just what I had around the shop. And then I'll be using some pine as well as some thicker poplar for the top and the base of the columns. And then the trim is going to be a mixture of poplar and pine. Ideally, I would have used poplar for this entire build, but because it's being painted, I've chosen to use a couple different species for different parts of the mantle. So now that we've talked about materials, let's talk about some of the tools we'll be using for this build. We'll be using the CSC50 cordless table saw, the TS60 track saw. We've got our Carvex jigsaw, CXS12 and our CXS18, the OF1010 and OF1400 grouters, DF500 domino. We have the ETS-C125 with the edge sanding attachment, and the ETS-EC125, as well as we have our Capex over here, and then our two dust extractors. First thing we're going to work on are the tapered columns. I've gone ahead and I've broken down all the sheet goods into rough dimensions with the TS60. Next thing we're going to do is cut them to their final dimensions with the TS60 and the CSC50. The layout of the tapered columns is pretty straightforward. I typically will work backwards. I'll draw the height and the width of the mantle and play with the dimensions till it looks right to me. So we have the front and then the two sides. So the taper will only be on the front section. And the front section and the two side sections are both 2 foot 9 inches long. We'll start at 8 and 11/16 and it'll end at 5.5 inches. That works out to about a 2.5 degree angle. I could measure each one of my tapers, but I'm going to go ahead and use the FS angle unit. Set this to 2.5 degrees. That way I know each one of my tapers is going to be exactly the same. I've gone ahead and double checked my bevel setting and my depth setting. Now I can go ahead and make my cut. So before I go to change the angle to cut the other side of the taper, I'll bring my other front panel over and cut the same angle on this one as well. Now I can adjust the angle unit to 2.5 degrees on the other side of 90 to cut the opposing taper on both the front panels. Now I have two identical fronts. I can start working on the sides. I love using the CSC50 for smaller pieces like this. When it comes to large sheet goods or hardwoods, I'll still go back to my track saws. So the left and right sides of both the columns are just going to be a simple straight 45 degree bevel. I can do that on the CSC50. While I still have the CSC50 out, the next thing I'm going to cut is the base to both the columns. So this is just a piece of plywood that's going to hold all three sides together. So you've got the column, the taper going up this direction. So I need to bevel both those edges to match that taper. With the CSC 50, I can easily set that blade to 2.5 degree bevel, set my fence, push both these through there, and I'll be done. So now that we've got all the pieces cut for both tapered columns, the next thing we need to do is cut the angle at the top and the bottom of all the side pieces. So if we just put these two together, this is what your tapered column is going to look like. And right now, the top and the bottom is cut at 90 degrees. So when I go to put dominoes in there, it's going to be off kilter. So I need to cut the top and the bottom at a 2.5 degree bevel to match this 2.5 degree taper. Before I go to cut the top and bottom angles, I'll go ahead and mark top and bottom on all my pieces. 2.5 degrees is a very shallow angle, so I've gone ahead and marked them on all the boards so that when I get over to the Capex, I'm not confused in any way and I know exactly which way to cut them. One of my favorite features on the Capex is being able to set this bevel. Simply just lift the lock, adjust my bevel, and I can dial it right into 2.5 degrees, lock that down, and now I'm set for both angles. I've set each stop the same distance from the blade, which is the total length of my leg. That way I can go back and forth without having to change the stops each time. So now with everything cut, the next step is going to be putting the domino mortises in. Easiest way I found to do that is I'll just get a nice straight board. I'll go ahead and get one set of my pieces for the tapered columns. And I'll go ahead and mark them all. These are all going to be the A group, these will be the B group. So that way I know when I start assembling, I know all three of these go together, all three of those go together. With everything flushed up on the bottom here, I can then take another straight edge and start drawing for my mortises. The other three mortises that I'm going to be putting in the length of this, those all be on the loose setting, which is about 3/16 of an inch bigger. So that'll give me some slop to move back and forth, but I'll still have that top mortise. That is going to be set on the tight setting on the domino machine. That'll be my alignment mortise. So that'll basically line up the tops perfectly flush. So I'm going to go ahead and mark all of these as loose so that I have a visual cue as I'm making the mortises that the machine is set to the correct setting. So another reason I like using this straight edge to line everything up is I can verify and find out exactly how long the center panel is supposed to be. Because I cut these all the same length initially, but when I cut those angles on the two side pieces, that made them slightly shorter. Now I can take this straight edge, line it up with my two side pieces, and see exactly how much of that center I need to cut off. Now that I have all these laid out, I can go ahead and get the other set, lay those out, and then we can do all the mortises on all of them. So with both the left and the right tapered column laid out, we can go ahead and get the domino machine out, get it set up, and get it ready to start making some mortises. I already have a 5mm cutter in here because I'll be using a 5 by 30mm tenon. And I'm going to set my depth to 15. So that'll plunge into the material 15mm. Now because I'm going to be using it on a 45, there's a couple ways you can set that. I can go ahead and use the scale on the side and set it to the 45-degree detent. What I actually like to do is I will take the entire base off the domino and I will set the fence to the bevel itself. That way I know it's exactly matching what that bevel is cut to. The last adjustment is the fence height. I want to make sure that I place the mortise high enough in that bevel so it doesn't protrude through the back side. To do that, I'll just completely take the step gauge out of play, bottom the fence out, lock that down. Now that mortise is gonna be as high up as it can possibly be and still give enough strength to hold those pieces together. Right now I have it set as a tight setting, so it's exactly the size of the domino tenon. That'll be my first one on all of my pieces because that's gonna be my alignment mortise. It's gonna get everything flushed up on the top. And I will reference my flap off the edge of my material. Then all the ones that I marked loose, I will turn when the machine is on to the loose setting, the second setting, and that'll give me a little bit of play when I go to assemble these. I'm ready to start making some mortises. So now that I have my tight alignment mortise done, I can go ahead and turn the machine on, switch it to the second loose setting, line up my crosshairs with my pencil mark, and do the rest of the mortises. With all those mortises complete, now I can move on to the dry fit stage. Anytime I'm doing a dry fit, I always get a piece of sandpaper, and the little edge on the dominoes, I'll sand those down so they'll go into the mortises much easier. It won't affect alignment, it'll just make my life a lot easier. Dry fits look pretty good on both of them. The next phase is we're going to start the glue up. Glue up process will just entail me taking these apart again, removing the tenons, apply glue to the joint as well as the mortises and tenons, put them in clamps, and move on to the next one. So within clamps, I can just get a little water on a rag, wipe down any glue squeeze out. And if there are any joints that didn't close up all the way, I can just take a screwdriver or anything that's rounded and kind of burnish those edges. Close those off and make a nice tight joint. I'll be making the base for the two columns out of this 1.5" poplar. The corners will be beveled at 45-degree angles. I'll be using the TS60 as well as the MFT hardware crosscut setup to cut those bevels. I don't know the exact depth of this material at a 45, so all I'm gonna do is just bottom the saw out till it hits the MDF of the table. Then I'll adjust my stop up to that point. Now I can just lower it another 1/16 or so, and I know I'm gonna cut all the way through that material. I can do that if I'm cutting at a 45-degree bevel or if I'm cutting at 0 degrees as well. First cut I'm gonna do is just one straight bevel so I can measure off that long point, the 10 and 13/16 I need for the front of my column base. Then from there I can measure off 7 and 13/16 for the two side pieces. Just gonna roll the MFT cart over so I have something to catch the off fall from this piece. So I know I'm gonna need two of these pieces exactly the same, so I can just flip this one over, reference off my stop with the long point, and cut the next one. So now I have two front pieces. I can flip this one over and measure out 7 and 13/16 for the other one. The assembly of the base for the columns is going to be much like the assembly for the tapered columns themselves. We'll be using the domino, except I've changed out the 5mm cutter to an 8mm cutter. And instead of laying out marks for all the mortises, we'll just be using the flaps off of the top and bottom edge. I'm going to put 2 mortises in each 45-degree bevel. The only markings I need to put on the base is labeling for each piece so I know they go together, top and bottom of each set. So I'm going to set this to 20. And the fence height, we're actually going to use 25 in the viewing window. And then I can set this 245. I'll go ahead and double check it with the bevel that I've got on the material. All of my tops will have a tight mortise. All the bottoms will be a loose mortise. If all the mortise is cut, I can go ahead and do a dry fit. So with these glued up in clamps, we can go ahead and install these blocks in the bottom of the columns. This will help me secure it to the base when we get to that step. And on the edges of these blocks, I cut them to the same 2.5 degree bevel to match the taper of the columns. So I'll add a little glue to the edges and some brad nails to secure it. So these are all dried up. This is all nailed in. Next thing we can do is talk about attaching the column to the base, and we'll be using the domino connectors. As far as laying out where the domino connectors are gonna go, I'm just gonna set it on top of the base and then measure and make sure my reveal is the same all the way around. And I'll actually draw a pencil line, and that'll be my reference mark for the domino machine itself. With the layout marks on there, now I'm gonna actually put a reference mark for each tenon that I'm gonna have. One on each side, approximately center. Doesn't have to be exact. So now that I've removed the column, I'm actually gonna draw where the mortises are gonna go so that I know exactly which side of that line that I drew they're gonna go on. I'll be using one connector and two 8mm tenons for this joint. The connector itself is made up of a few different parts. We have the expansion connector, the center post, the post housing, and the centering lock. To place my mortises correctly, I'm going to reference the fence of the domino off the inside of the column base. I'll have the step setting to 20mm. That means that from the fence to the center of my cutter, it'll be 10mm. So the inside of the column base to the center of my cutter is 10mm. I'll take the exact opposite and reference the fence off the outside of the column, and then from the outside down is 10mm, and that'll line everything up perfectly on top of the column base. I'll be using the connector on the front of the column base. The expansion part of the connector has to be mortised in 15mm. Then I'll be using the solid 8x40 wood tenons on the two sides. Those have to be mortised in 20mm. I'll make the adjustments on the domino machine itself. The rest of the connector is going to go on the top part of the column. That has to be plunged in 28mm deep. I'll make that adjustment on the domino. So while I still have this clamped in place, I need to drill a hole for that center post connector. I'll use the supplied drilling attachment that goes into the mortise, lock that in place, and drill my hole. With all the holes drilled, all the mortises cut, we can go ahead and assemble the top to the bottom. With this complete, I can do the same process with the other column. So with those two assembled, the next step in the process is to work on the base molding and the cap trim. I know I cut both columns exactly the same size. So what I'll do is I'll measure one column, then I'll pre-assemble it and install it onto the column. That way I can get tighter miters. With all the pieces cut, I'll go ahead and do a test fit, and then I can put it in glue. I'll be using some glue, some spring clamps, and a headless pin nailer to attach all these trim pieces together. So now I can set these aside to dry while we work on the base molding. The process will be the same on the base molding. Measurements will be the same from both columns. So I'll just get my measurements and go over to the miter saw and start cutting. So now we can go through the same process of glue up using the spring clamps, glue, and a pin nailer. These have sat long enough for the glue to set up. I'll go ahead and pull the spring clamps off and install them onto the base of the columns. Now I'll just do the same thing with the base molding. That finishes up the columns. We'll do a little bit of light sanding. So I'm just trying to remove any pencil marks, a little bit of glue residue, so I'll be using 120 grit granite. Then we can start working on the top section. I've already gone ahead and ripped the bottom and the sides to 7 inches in width, and the front is going to be 9.5 inches. I've cut the 2 longest pieces to their final length of 60 inches. Now I just need to bevel the sides and the bottom. We can join those together with dominoes. Because this is a slightly smaller piece, I'm not as comfortable holding it close to the blade. I'm going to set up what I call a bridge clamp. So basically I have my piece where it's going to be when it gets cut. I set up a stop with another block of wood, and then a block that goes over both of those that I can then clamp in place. Now that'll hold my piece with my hands out of the way. To join these two together, we'll be using 5x30 domino tenons. I switched out the cutter to a 5mm cutter, set my depth to 15 millimeters, and my fence height is as high as it can go so that I get into the meat of that bevel. I won't be measuring anything out for the layout of the mortises. I'll be utilizing the flaps like we've done before. One will be tight and one will be loose. The tight one will be my alignment mortise to get everything flushed up, and then the loose one will just help secure it all together. So while we're here, we'll go ahead and do a test fit. Go ahead and flip it around and do the same on the other side. With the dry fit looking good, I'll take it apart, put some glue and clamps on it. While that glue sets up, I can start laying out for my mortises. I'll be utilizing wood tenons as well as the domino connectors to help clamp it all together. So I've done all my layout marks for the dominoes. Now I want to do just some reference marks that will act as more of a visual cue so I know how to orient the domino when I'm making the mortises. And then the last thing I'm going to do is draw where the post housings for the connectors are going to go. There'll be 4 of these. So I'll start by making my mortises for the expansion connectors. I'll be mortising vertically into this board right here. When I'm plunging vertically, I need some more support, so that's what this little foot is for. I've set the plunge depth to 15 millimeters, and that's what I'll do for all these mortises, whether it's the expansion connector or the wood domino. So on this side of the material, I'll be using the center post housing. For that depth, I'll have to switch the machine from 15 to 28. I'll also be using that same depth for all the solid wood tenons. Went 15 in here, 28 in here, because I'll be using a 8 by 36 millimeter tenon that comes with the domino connector assortment sustainer. With all the mortises done, I can go ahead and start dry fitting everything. The dry fit all looks good. Go ahead and take it apart. We'll add some glue, set this aside, and then we'll start working on the top of the mantle. I've already cut the top to the correct length. Next, I'm going to rip it to the right width. Then we'll do a little sanding, and then we'll dress up the edges a little bit with the routers. And to do the rip, I've gone ahead and switched the blade out to the 28 tooth ripping blade. The board's in pretty good shape. There's just a couple spots right here I want to touch up with the sander. I've got 80 grit on here, so it shouldn't take any time at all. With everything sanded up, we can go ahead and start working on the edges of the top. For the bottom of the top, I've got a chamfer bit on here. It's just going to give it a nice little detail to look at. And for the top, I've just got a simple round over just to smooth those edges out, because that's typically where everybody rubs their hands. For the round over, I'm going to be using the 1010, and for the larger chamfer, I'll be using the 1400. I've gone ahead and I've switched over to the 36 millimeter hose for just better dust extraction with bigger chips. So I'll do the two sides and the front, and then we'll switch over to the chamfer to do the bottom. The first pass turned out pretty good, but there's a couple spots that had some chatter, so I'm going to utilize the micro adjust to give me just a little bit more on the next pass. I'm not going to take off a whole lot, just enough to smooth it out. So now I'll flip it over, switch over to the 1400 and do that chamfer. With both those edge profiles complete, now I can focus on laying out the mantle box to the mantle top. The dimensions of the crown molding that I picked out determined the distance around the front of the box. So I would have the same reveal on the sides as well as the front. So I've got it positioned exactly where I want it. I've got it flush with the back of the mantle top. And then I've found the center of the mantle top as well as the box, line those two up so my reveal on the ends is exactly the same. Now I'm going to trace around the inside of the box and the outside of the box. That'll give me a reference on where I want to place my mortises. While everything's still in place, I'll go ahead and mark the mantle top and the box for exactly where I want my mortises. What I've done is I've clamped a guide rail to the outside edge of my box. Now I can reference the back of my domino off my guide rail, and I've got the center line of my mortises. Now I know from the guide rail to the center of my mortise is going to be 10 millimeters, which is exactly what the distance from the back of the domino to right here is 10 millimeters to the center of the mortise. So all these mortises will be on a tight setting because they're going to be the expansion connectors. I've got my plunge depth set to 15. Now it's just a matter of lining up the crosshairs and making my mortises. And since there's only 2 of these, I'll just line up the back of the domino with this pencil line and use the crosshairs to line up with my center line. I've lowered the fence to the 90-degree position, and I've set my fence height to 20 millimeters. So the center of my mortise will be 10 millimeters off this face. And I'll be changing the plunge depth to 28 millimeters. The trim around the bottom of the mantle box will serve a couple different purposes. It's going to cover the joint between the bottom of the mantle box and the side of the mantle box. And it'll also give a nesting spot for the columns when we go to attach those, and it'll also cover the joint between the columns and the bottom of the mantle box. So I've determined the placement of this trim. I went and set my square. Now I'll just put a pencil line across the whole bottom of the box. The process will be much like I did with the trim on the tapered columns. So I'll grab some measurements and make some cuts. Sometimes it's easier putting the material on the base that it's going to be attached to, marking where it's going to get cut, than taking a tape measure and trying to hold it on a short point of a bevel. Like I did with the trim on the tapered columns, I'll go ahead and pre-assemble this and then install it on the box. With that trim complete, we can go ahead and work on the medallion. I've already ripped this material to the width that I would like. Now I'm going to cut it to fit in between the trim and the mantle top. So now that I've verified that the medallion piece fits in here, I want to see where my crown is going to terminate into the medallion. So typically what I'll do is I'll just grab a piece of the crown, cut a small chunk off, hold it up here so it nests correctly, and then I'll get a mark. But I'm gonna need it again when I start cutting my crown molding, so I've actually cut a block that's the same dimensions as the nested position of my crown. I'll mark both sides, and it'll tell me exactly where I can start the taper of my medallion. The bottom of the medallion is gonna be 3.5 inches wide. Half of 3.5 is 1 3/4. And now I'll just connect those 2 dots, and then I know that is the piece I want to cut off. Then I can just use the lasers on the Capex to line up with my pencil mark. So before I attach this, I'm going to just take a hand sanding block and soften some of the edges. Then to secure it, I'll just use a little glue and some pin nails. So with the medallion secured, I can go ahead and start cutting my crown. I'm going to do that in a few different sections, so we'll head over to the Capex and start cutting that. There's two ways to cut crown molding, in the nested or the flat position. The nested position is when you're actually cutting it the way it'll be installed into your project. Cutting it flat is simply laying it flat on the saw. I prefer to cut it in the nested position. To do that, you want to make sure you hold it in that same position each and every time you make a cut. So I'll be utilizing the MDF template that comes with the Capex crown extensions for the UG stand. To get that set up, I'm going to use that block that I cut earlier that determines the height of my crown. This will position the MDF template off my fence the correct distance to cut my crown. Now you can see when I set my crown in here, it's fitting tight up against the fence and tight up against the base, so no matter which way I position my saw, it's going to cut it correctly. So the first sub-assembly will be the side piece and the front piece up to the medallion. So I'll grab those measurements and make some cuts. So the fit of those pieces looks good. I'll go ahead and glue them up, pin nail them, then I can start working on the center assemblies. With the two outer sections complete, I can focus on the center section. So we'll have the two returns, one on each side, and then one centerpiece. To get the measurement for this last piece, I'll just hold it up there and mark it. So those look good. I'll go ahead and pull them out, add some glue and nails, and then I'll install it all as one piece. So at this stage, you can do one of two things. You can install the mantle top by itself and just attach it to a wall, or we can attach the tapered columns, which I'll show you how to do now. I'm just going to put two mortises in here, so I'll reference my flaps of the domino off of this edge, which will put me 37 millimeters in on each side, and then I'll do the same thing on the column. So I've changed the domino cutter to a 5 millimeter cutter, so we're using a 5x30 tenon, and I've set the depth to 15 millimeters. I don't need to adjust the fence at all because I'm going to be plunging vertically. I'll make the corresponding mortises on the columns, and then we'll do a dry fit. Those both fit very nice. The next step in the process is to lay out, cut, and install this arch. So I know this taper is 2.5 degrees. I can grab my measurement from post to post, cut that dimension, and then lay out for my arch. So I know I want the arch to be 1 inch less than the total width of my board. My board was 4 inches, so the top of my arch will be at 3 inches. I'm just going to use a piece of material that's flexible, clamp on 2 ends, trace the arch. So I'll cut up right to the line with the Carvex, and I'll come back with the ETS 125 and sand it smooth. So with the edge sanding attachment, I can get a nice square edge sanded right up to that line. So with that cut and shaped, now I can just pre-drill and attach it with some screws so I can take this apart and reassemble it later. With the arch installed, the fireplace mantle is now complete. Really excited about how this turned out. Thank you to everyone that participated in the poll. I had a great time building it. Now the few things I have left to do is a little bit of light sanding, fill some nail holes, prime it, and then paint it. If you like this build series and you'd like to see more, check out our channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next build series. If you want to be notified when we upload new content, click that notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe.